in the rolling hills of central Virginia. There once stood a farm that has since vanished from every official map, though the land itself remains, accessible only to those who know where to search. Its records were mysteriously purged from county ledgers around 1871, with no explanation ever given. Locals who remember the old tales might tell you, if you catch them in the right mood, that the strangeness began the summer the well was drained. This well had been there for nearly 2 centuries, hand-dug, lined with stone, and sunk 30 feet into the red Virginia clay. Generations had drawn water from it without incident. When the final owners decided the water had finally run out, they hired 4 men to pump it dry and seal it permanently. The crew arrived on a Monday. By Tuesday evening, 2 had quit. By Wednesday, the remaining 2 had fled the county entirely. When a 5th man was finally coaxed into descending to see what they'd uncovered, he scrambled back up in under 10 minutes, climbed into his wagon, and drove off without a word, or his pay. No one ever officially recorded what lay at the bottom, but a private letter, discovered years later among a Lynchburg lawyer's estate papers, hinted that the space below hadn't been carved by water. It had been built. Before we go deeper into the Vos's farm and the secrets beneath it, if you're new here, welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. We love hearing where our audience is tuning in, because the story of what was built at the bottom of that well, and who built it, and why it had to be sealed away, reaches far beyond the farm itself. It begins with a war most people have stopped discussing, and ends with a secret 3 families spent 30 years trying to bury. To grasp what was found beneath the Vos's land, you first have to understand what that part of Virginia was like before the Civil War, and what it became afterward. West of Lynchburg. In the counties that press against the Blue Ridge, the land wasn't suited for the grand plantations of the Tidewater. The farms were smaller, the terrain rocky and broken, unsuitable for the large-scale tobacco farming that built dynasties along the James River. Instead, the hill farmers relied on self-sufficiency and a fierce independence. They were suspicious of outsiders and fiercely protective of whatever they'd carved from the land. The Vosses had occupied their parcel since the 1680s. Of Welsh descent, they'd arrived with a small group of early colonists, slowly pushing inland, away from the coast, until they found a hollow between 2 ridges that front right. There they built a stone house, dug a well, cleared timber, and settled in for the long haul. By the Revolution, they were 3 generations deep. By the 1840s, 5. In the years that matter to us, the household was headed by Nathaniel Vosses, a man in his mid-50s by the late 1850s, broad-shouldered, quieter than his father had been. He had 2 grown sons, Emmett and Calhoun, who worked the farm alongside him, a wife, Dorothea, who'd grown up a Pendleton in Amherst County, and brought with her a particular set of beliefs about how things should be done, and a daughter, Louisa, 17 in 1858, whose journal would later become the primary record of what unfolded on the farm. The Vosses weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They owned 3 enslaved people, George, Hattie, and Hattie's 12-year-old son, Wren. The legal and moral machinery that bound them was something Nathaniel had inherited along with the farm, the well, and everything else. He hadn't precisely chosen it, but he hadn't refused it either. The farm's geography was key. The hollow was narrow, flanked by steep ridges that made travel difficult. The dirt road connecting them to the county road was poor in summer, nearly impassable in winter. Their nearest neighbor, Crockett Farley, ran a gristmill about 2 miles south, close enough for emergencies, far enough to be invisible day to day. The Vosses were, in essence, their own world. The well sat in the center of the yard between house and barn. So old that no one alive remembered its construction. Tradition held it was sunk by the original Welsh settlers around 1690. Lined with dry, fitted fieldstone, it produced cold, clean water year-round. In summer, you could feel cool air rising from it. In winter, the stone rim was often the only frost-free spot in the yard. Louisa mentioned the well several times in her journal before anything went wrong. Not because it was remarkable, but as a matter of course. She wrote about drawing water in the early mornings, about her brother Emmett dropping a bucket in and fishing it out with wire, and about a strange, low sound that sometimes rose from it on still summer nights. A sound like breathing, which she attributed to wind moving through rock far below. She noted it made her uneasy, but unease was nothing unusual on the Vosses' farm in the summer of 1858. That summer changed everything, and the change came from something 20 miles away. A man named Josiah Trent, who owned a larger farm near Rustburg, had been part of a loosely organized, carefully concealed network moving enslaved people northward through the hill country for about 15 years. It was dangerous work, and Trent hadn't taken it up out of pure abolitionist conviction. He'd stumbled into it, the records suggest, through a tangled mix of financial and moral obligations to a Quaker merchant in Lynchburg named Caleb Drummond. The two had quietly helped a significant number of people reach free states via a route winding through mountain hollows and over ridges into western Virginia. In June 1858, Trent was caught. The Lynchburg Virginian reported his arrest on June 14, and Louisa mentions reading about it, though she doesn't say where. The news sent tremors through every hill country household connected to Trent's work. The authorities knew he hadn't acted alone, and they were patient. Nathaniel Vosses read the report with the same expression he'd use inspecting a poorly set fence post. Dry, careful, giving nothing away. Then he folded the paper and burned it. 3 nights later, a stranger Louisa had never seen appeared at the back door after midnight. She heard the low knock, her father's voice, the door opening and closing. She didn't go downstairs. The next morning, she noted in her journal that she'd heard at least 2 voices besides her father's, and the barn door opening and later closing. She didn't yet understand what she was hearing, but she remembered it with the precision of someone who already sensed that what was happening wasn't safe to discuss. Nathaniel had been part of Trent's network for at least 4 years before the arrest. Louisa would later piece together, and the route through the Vosses Hollow made use of a feature no county surveyor had ever examined closely: the well. Specifically, what lay beneath it. Because the well wasn't simply a well. 30 feet down, just below the water table's lower edge, the shaft didn't end in a clay floor. It opened, widened, became something else entirely. Whoever dug the original well had gone through the rock, not just for water, but to connect with something already there. A natural limestone fissure running roughly north-south beneath the hollow. Into that fissure, someone had done deliberate work. Cut the ceiling higher, laid a stone floor, shored the walls with timbers that by 1858 were already failing. They'd created a room 30 feet below the farmyard. By the time 4 workmen were hired to drain and seal the well in 1871, that room had held human beings for a very long time. To understand the room, you have to understand how it worked. And to understand that, you have to go back further than Nathaniel, further even than Trent's network. The limestone country of central Virginia is riddled with caves and passages, the same geology that later produced tourist caverns. But those were just the visible part of an extensive underground landscape. One indigenous peoples had known for centuries, and settlers discovered piecemeal as they dug foundations. Wells and root cellars. The Welsh settlers who arrived in the 1680s were miners by tradition, trained to read the land for what hid below coal seams, lead deposits, connecting passages. When Nathaniel's great-grandfather sank his well, he wasn't surprised to find the rock open below the water line. He'd been looking for it, sounding the ground with a steel rod as he'd been taught. The hollow place was there before he broke the surface. What he built down there in those early years was a storage room, a place to keep things that shouldn't freeze or spoil, smoked meat, seed grain, reserves that could mean life or death in a hard winter. This is documented, after a fashion, in a fragment of a letter written in Welsh, found decades later folded inside the cover of a family Bible. A scholar translating it in the 1890s described a room below the water source. Cool, dry, suitable for preservation, accessible only through the well shaft above. For perhaps a century, that's all it was, a cold cellar with a difficult entry, used, then forgotten as the family built proper above-ground storage. But by the 1850s, Nathaniel, who'd known about the room since childhood, shown it by his father, who'd been shown it by his, had repurposed it in a way his Welsh ancestor could never have imagined. The room became a stop on a route, moving human beings through darkness toward something like light. How many people passed through it during Nathaniel's connection to Trent's network can't be determined precisely. Louisa eventually pieced together that the number was over 40, possibly closer to 80. People who arrived in the night were lowered through the well shaft by rope and board seat, spent 1 to 4 days below, and were moved on to the next link in the chain. The room had food, water, a lamp with enough oil for several days, and, Louisa noted, a collection of good wool blankets her mother had quietly acquired over the years. Dorothea Pendleton Vosses wasn't just aware of what her husband was doing. She was an active, essential part of it. This was the part of the story the Lynchburg attorney's letter touched on most obliquely. The letter described the room as having been built, not dug, because the attorney's family understood that word to mean something specific. The room had been fashioned over decades into a place people could survive in. That was the horror and the miracle simultaneously. Someone had taken a natural crack in the limestone and made it livable. Installed shoring, flooring, ventilation via a second, narrower fissure opening on the hillside behind Mountain Laurel. They'd thought through what a human being would need to survive 2, 3, 4 days in the dark underground. That care, sustained, deliberate, long-term, wasn't something Nathaniel had done alone or quickly. It was the work of years, possibly of more than one generation. And its very deliberateness, the human scale, the thought behind the blankets and lamp oil and ventilation, was what disturbed the men who came to drain and seal the well in 1871, years after the war, and the legal reason for the room no longer existed. The room was empty by then. But it wasn't abandoned in the way unused spaces are. It was preserved, the lamp trimmed and filled, the blankets folded, a tin cup on a limestone ledge, and inside the cup, a folded piece of paper with a list of names. That list was what sent the fifth workman up, without collecting his pay. He could read just enough. What he saw 30 feet underground in 1871 carried a weight he couldn't calculate. He left, telling his employer only that the well needed to be sealed from the top and left alone, and that he wouldn't discuss his reasons. The employer, a Lynchburg contractor named Silas Poor, recognized when a conversation was over. He sealed the well, billed the estate, and said nothing further, for years. It was Poor who eventually wrote the letter that ended up in Edmund Caskey's estate papers, around 1876, in response to a legal inquiry about the Vosses' property. He described the room, the blankets, the lamp, the ventilation shaft, the tin cup, and the folded paper. He didn't reproduce the names, but he described the paper. Old, folded many times, written in at least 2 hands. The ink faded to pale brown at the top and darker toward the bottom, as if the list had been started decades earlier and added to over time. Caskey's response isn't preserved. But what is preserved in Campbell County Courthouse records? Not subject to the same careful editing as the county where the farm was located, is a deed transfer dated 1877. The Vosses farm changed hands for well below market value. The purchaser was a holding company whose principals included Cornelius Dabney, a former county court member, deeply invested in the Trent investigation. Dabney hadn't found what he was looking for in 1858. The investigation hadn't reached the Vosses farm. Nathaniel had been careful, the hollow remote, and those who knew about the room were either dead or silent. Trent himself had never told anyone the full route. This was deliberate. Those running these routes understood the weakest point was anyone who knew the whole picture. Trent knew his stretch. The next person knew theirs. An arrest could yield only fragments. Nathaniel's name never appeared in the investigation. What Dabney brought to the search, still pursuing it nearly 20 years later, wasn't information from the investigation, but something more personal. He'd been a county court member, a man for whom Trent's network wasn't just a legal violation, but a personal affront to the system of order and hierarchy he'd built his life around. A system the war had dismantled, and he was trying to rebuild. He'd spent post-war years learning what the 1858 investigation had failed to establish. He'd talked to people, paid for information, read closed documents. By 1877, he'd arrived at the Vosses' farm and the sealed well. What he expected to find isn't known. What he found during his ownership between 1877 and 1879 also isn't known. The farm was quiet, the well sealed, the house deteriorating. Then came the fire. Fires in rural Virginia in 1879 weren't unusual, but stone houses don't burn the way wooden ones do. What burns in a stone house is everything inside. Floors, ceilings, furniture, papers, books, the accumulated physical record of nearly 2 centuries of family presence. The fire destroyed whatever remained in the house, whatever Nathaniel had kept, Dorothea had stored, whatever traces of what had happened between 1854 and 1861 had survived the war, Nathaniel's death, the workmen and the sale, all of it ash. The well survived, the room survived. But the connection between the room and the records that might have explained it was severed. The farm sat empty for 2 years, the house deteriorating, the barn roof sagging. Then, in 1879, a fire of uncertain origin destroyed the stone house down to its foundations. The well survived, being stone and 30 feet deep. But by then the list of names in the tin cup was gone, disappeared sometime between 1871 and 1879. No one has ever established when it was taken or by whom. What remained were the names themselves, not on paper, but in memory, and memory is both more durable and more mutable than paper. Louisa Vosses wasn't on the farm in 1871. She'd married in 1865 and was living 40 miles away when the workmen came. But she'd known about the room since she was 17. More than her journal revealed during her father's lifetime. Because there were pages she'd carefully cut out, removing them without disturbing the binding. The cuts were still visible when the journal eventually surfaced years later. Whatever she'd written on those pages was gone. The journal itself was a plain thing. A repurposed bookkeeper's ledger, its original columns still faintly visible. Louisa had been writing in it since she was 15. Early entries were what you'd expect. Weather, garden notes, church services, occasional visits to Lynchburg. There was a thread about a young man from the Cabell family that stopped abruptly in early 1858, without resolution. as if she'd decided some narratives were better left unfinished in writing. What remained after the cut pages was still substantial. Years of entries covering the war, her marriage, her early years in Rockbridge County, the births of her children. But the gap was visible, not just in missing leaves, but in the texture of the writing around it. The entries immediately before and after had a careful, slightly formal quality. Deliberately unremarkable, written with an awareness of being read. The cut entries covered approximately 14 months, from autumn 1858 through the end of 1859. The months after Trent's arrest, when the network went quiet and the route north closed. What was happening in the room below the well during that time, without the usual movement of the chain above, went unrecorded. What she wrote in January 1860 was about a snowfall. 2 feet of snow. The road impassable, her brothers shoveling out the barn and the well. She described the well the same way. She always had a landmark, the fixed point around which the property orbited. She said nothing about what was 30 feet below it. She was 18 when the 14 months began, 19 when they ended. Whatever she knew, whatever she'd been part of or witnessed, or simply heard through a bedroom window, she decided to carry it herself, not to put it on paper. She lived until 1903, outliving her husband and 2 of her 4 children, watching the world change in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She never returned to the Vosses farm after her marriage. She never mentioned it directly in any surviving letter or document. The only exception was a letter to her daughter about the fire, with the strange closing about hoping the trouble might now be allowed to rest. Her daughter, who'd never known the farm, kept it among her papers without thinking much about it. Louisa was still alive in 1879 when the stone house burned. She wrote about it to her daughter in a letter that survived among the Prout family papers. Not because anyone was looking for it, but because it was unremarkable. She described hearing about the fire from a neighbor, her feelings with controlled brevity. She said she was sorry the house was gone, that it had been a good house, and that she hoped whatever had been troubling that particular piece of ground might now be allowed to rest. It was a strange way to put it. Her daughter didn't find it strange enough to ask about. And for a long time, that was where the trail ended. Buried under a fire, a land transfer, and carefully edited courthouse ledgers, the trail might have ended permanently if not for a woman named Prudence Farley, granddaughter of Crockett Farley, the nearest neighbor, the man with the gristmill 2 miles south. Crockett had died in 1883, leaving behind a box of personal papers that sat in an attic for 40 years. When Prudence opened it in 1921, she found what you'd expect from a 19th century mill operator. Ledgers, correspondence about grain prices, a deed, letters from relatives, and one thing you wouldn't, a sealed envelope in Crockett's handwriting, unaddressed, with the instruction, "Do not open until I am gone." He'd been dead 38 years. Prudence opened it. Inside was a single sheet covered on both sides in his careful, cramped hand, dated July 1868. It described, in the methodical way of a man who spent his life keeping accounts, what Crockett Farley had known about the Vosses farm and the room beneath the well. He'd known more than a neighbor 2 miles away might be expected to, because he'd been part of it. His penmanship throughout most of the document was the even script of an accountant. Legibility is honesty, but in the paragraph describing his own involvement, the letters grew slightly larger, slightly less regular, as if the act of finally committing this to paper, after 9 years, had unlocked something. He wrote that he'd never considered himself brave, practical above all. The calculation he'd made in the early 1850s, when Nathaniel had begun feeling him out over several visits, reading his responses with the patience of a man who knew a thing said, too directly couldn't be unsaid, was that the risk of involvement was manageable, and the risk of knowing and doing nothing was a different kind. The blankets and lamp oil were small things to provide. What he hadn't anticipated was how the knowledge would settle into him, becoming part of his daily mental furniture in a way the labor of providing supplies wasn't. You could finish trimming a lamp wick, pack it, hand it to Nathaniel, walk home, and the lamp was done. The knowledge of why it existed, who would use it, where it would go, that didn't finish. That stayed. He hadn't been religious. His wife had been Presbyterian. He'd attended services and thought his own thoughts. But after that first year, he found himself in idle moments at the mill thinking about certain sermon passages, about being a stranger in a strange land, about the valley of darkness. These thoughts, he acknowledged, didn't help with anything practical. But they stayed, making the mill feel different. The sound of the water carrying something he couldn't name. His mill was too visible to be a station on the road, but as a supplier and watcher, he'd provided lamp oil and blankets, bought in small quantities over several years, never enough to attract notice. He'd watched the road for investigators and sent word when they were coming. But the letter also described something else, something Crockett had seen on a specific night in September 1859, 14 months after Trent's arrest, when the investigation seemed to have died down and the network was cautiously resuming. He'd been returning from his mill late. A broken wheel shaft had kept him. Walking his horse in the dark on the road north of his property, when he saw lights at the Vosses' farm that shouldn't have been there. Not in the house, in the yard. 2 lanterns moving in a specific pattern he recognized from legitimate visits, one at the barn door, one at the well. But there was a third light, appearing and disappearing. Someone going up and down the well shaft with a lantern. He stopped and watched. Over the course of about an hour and a half, the third light went down and came up 11 times. He didn't approach, didn't call out. He went home, went to bed, said nothing. But he counted 11, and he wrote that number down in 1868 with the care of someone who understood it was a data point in an account that might someday need to be presented in full. 11 trips in an hour and a half, each about 8 or 9 minutes. The rope and board seat could carry one person at a time. Not all those trips were people. Some would be supplies, some rigging. But perhaps 5 or 6, perhaps as many as 8, were human beings lowered 30 feet into the earth on a September night. The most remarkable thing, however, was his final paragraph. On his next visit to the Vosses' farm 3 weeks later, returning a borrowed tool, passing an hour, he found Nathaniel in the yard near the well, doing something that initially looked like ordinary maintenance, clearing leaves, checking the rope. But as he got closer, he saw Nathaniel wasn't cleaning. He was examining the well, running his hands along the stones of the upper shaft, leaning over, listening. Nathaniel straightened, said nothing was wrong, just thought he'd heard something. Farley asked what kind of something. Nathaniel was quiet, then said something like a voice, but probably just the wind. Farley didn't say anything. He handed over the borrowed tool, stayed 20 minutes and left. But walking back toward the mill, he found himself thinking about the September night and the 11 trips, and whether all the people who'd gone down the shaft had come back up. He never asked. He wrote the question down in 1868 and sealed it for someone else to find. When Prudence read the paper in 1921, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then she put it back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the box, and put the box back in the attic. She didn't tell anyone, not immediately, but she'd read it, and she'd done the arithmetic. Prudence was 53. A practical schoolteacher, not given to flights of imagination. But the arithmetic lodged in her mind like a splinter, always present. It took her 6 years to act. In 1927. She wrote to a history professor at a small Roanoke college, who was researching what was then cautiously being called the Underground Railroad. Elbert Hogue had published several papers and was known for collecting personal accounts. Prudence described her grandfather's letter in general terms, asking if he knew of any documented routes through the Virginia Hill Country, and whether the Vos's farm appeared in his research. Hogue replied within a week. His 3-page letter began with a sentence that made Prudence put down her coffee. He knew the farm. Not from living memory, but from 2 other sources he hadn't been able to reconcile until her letter arrived. The first was a brief, unpublished account in a Pennsylvania Quaker newsletter from 1864. Written by a man who described himself only as having traveled through the mountain country before the war. The account was fragmentary and deliberately vague. The kind written by someone who knew details could still be dangerous. But it described a farm in a hollow, a well, a descent into the earth. Compared, with attempted lightness, to going down into the mine country of the old country. What he found below was unexpected. Not a cave, he wrote, but a room. In the room, 6 other people waiting. 7 people in the room beneath the Vos's well at the same time, sometime in 1857 or early 1858, before Trent's arrest. The second source was a collection of brief notes, in a cramped hand among the papers of Caleb Drummond, the Lynchburg Quaker merchant who'd entangled Trent in the network. Drummond had died in 1869. His papers had been donated to a Quaker meeting in Philadelphia, where they'd sat in a trunk for half a century. In those notes, partly English, partly a personal shorthand Hogue had decoded, were references to a station called Stone Bottom. Supplies delivered. Route confirmed. Stone Bottom holding 7. Route north clear as of 14th. 7 again. But here the arithmetic grew difficult. The newsletter account was written by a man who'd passed through. He'd gone down, found 6 waiting, made 7 total, later moved north, survived. Written about it. Drummond's notes described Stone Bottom holding 7 on a specific date. And then, a week later, a single entry. Stone Bottom, no word. Route north closed. Then Drummond's shorthand for the next entry. Trouble at Trent's. Advise caution all stations. June 1858. The arrest. The network going silent. Here was the question no one had ever been able to answer. What happened to the 7 people in the room when the route north closed? If it closed suddenly, if Nathaniel received word the investigators were coming, that usual contacts couldn't be reached. The network had gone to ground. Then the 7 were stranded. They couldn't go north, couldn't go south without huge risk. Couldn't emerge through the well shaft in daylight. They were below the earth in a room built for temporary occupation, supplies calculated for days, not weeks. Hogue had found no record of what happened to them. No account of 7 people emerging from the Virginia Hill Country in the summer of 1858 and reaching free states. No record of arrests either. No captured escaped enslaved people in that period, which might have generated documentation. Nothing. Which was its own kind of answer. When Prudence read Hogue's letter, she went back to the attic and reread her grandfather's final paragraph. Nathaniel at the well 3 weeks after the September 1859 night. The something like a voice. Probably just the wind. September 1859 was 15 months after Trent's arrest. 15 months of silence from whatever was in the room below. And yet, on that night, someone had been at the well with a lantern, going up and down 11 times. What Crockett had seen, what he'd counted and recorded and sealed away, without investigating further, was not people being lowered into the room. It was people being brought up. The question that followed wasn't comfortable. If someone was being brought up 15 months after the route closed, brought up in the dark, one at a time over an hour and a half, what condition were they in? Were they alive? All of them. How many had survived 15 months in a room designed for days? And if some hadn't? If the room had become something other than a refuge, what had Nathaniel done with them? Where do you put the ones who didn't make it? In a hollow full of investigators. There was one detail in her grandfather's letter Prudence had initially passed over. In describing the farm's layout, he'd noted that the area north of the well, between the well and the ridge, had been replanted with grass sometime around 1860. He mentioned it, the way you mentioned something slightly odd at the time, filed away without knowing what to do with it. The grass was thicker there, darker than the rest of the yard. Nathaniel had said he'd done some grading. Farley had nodded and thought no more of it, until he wrote the letter in 1868 and decided it was worth including, just in case. Prudence wrote back to Hogue. She told him about the envelope, the September night, the 11 trips, the thick, dark grass. She asked what he thought it meant. Hogue's response took 2 weeks. A single page, measured and careful. He wrote that he believed the Vos's farm had been an important station on a significant route, and that the events of 1858 had likely created extreme difficulty for everyone involved, including those sheltering in the room below. The historical record, he wrote, was often incomplete by design. He would like to visit the property if it was still accessible, to conduct a careful examination of the grounds, particularly the area north of the well shaft. He never made the visit. He died in February 1928, 4 months later from pneumonia. Prudence lived until 1941. She gave Hogue's letters and her grandfather's envelope to a niece with instructions to put them in a safe place. The niece, who never quite understood what they contained or why they mattered, put them in a box of family documents. The box eventually found its way, after several decades and moves, to an archive at a small historical society in the Virginia Hill Country, cataloged without particular attention and filed away. The farm itself is still there. The land changed hands several times. The barn fell. The well was sealed, with stone and mortar, as Silas Poor had been paid to do. The area north of the well, where the grass had grown thicker after 1860, is now overgrown with cedar and sumac, the way abandoned Virginia ground tends to go. The limestone below has never been formally surveyed. The room, 30 feet below the surface, accessible only through the shaft above, has never been officially documented or examined. The sealed well still sits in the middle of what used to be the yard, and the list of names, written in 2 hands, faded at the top, dark at the bottom, started decades before the war and added to over years, is gone. Removed before the fire. Taken by someone who understood what it meant, and what it could prove, and what was better to make disappear. Whether it was Cornelius Dabney or someone working for him or against him. Whether the names were destroyed or merely hidden, whether they still exist somewhere in a box or an envelope or folded inside a book, isn't known. What is known is that those names were real. The people they belonged to were real. They made a descent into the Virginia earth in the years before the war, trusting a stone room, a rope, and a Welsh farmer's family to keep them safe until the route north opened again. The route didn't open in time for all of them, and the ground north of the well is very flat. And the grass, even now, grows a little thicker there than anywhere else in the hollow. There's a particular silence around stories like this. Not the silence of things never known, but of things known by too many to be entirely forgotten and by too few to become official record. The Vos's history. its concealed infrastructure, its role in the network, the events of the summer and fall of 1858. The September night Crockett Farley watched from the road was never secret in the absolute sense. Too many people touched it. The workman who drained the well in 1871, Silas Poor who sealed it, Edmund Caskey who received the letter, Cornelius Dabney who bought the land, Crockett Farley who counted 11 and wrote it down, Louisa who cut pages from her journal and spent the rest of her life not talking about what she'd removed. All of these people knew something. None knew everything, and none were in a position, given Reconstruction Virginia's political climate, the ongoing danger of being connected to Trent's network, the specific legal jeopardy attached to certain knowledge, to say what they knew out loud in a form that would survive. The erasure wasn't one person's work. It was the accumulated result of dozens of small choices made by people navigating an extraordinarily complicated moral and legal landscape in a period when wrong information in the wrong hands could destroy a family or worse. Nathaniel didn't empty the courthouse ledgers. He didn't burn his own house. He simply went on living on a farm with a sealed well in the yard and a patch of ground to the north where the grass grew thick. He died in 1873, 2 years after the well was drained and sealed. The cause recorded in the family Bible, Louisa kept the record, was winter fever. He was 68. What he'd built over the years was the system around the room. The contacts, the timing, the supply chain, the careful watching of the county road, the management of a secret that grew larger and more dangerous with every year it was maintained. And what happened in the summer of 1858, when the road closed and the people below the well were stranded? Whatever he decided in those weeks and months, whatever choices he made, whatever the thick grass eventually came to cover, those decisions were made by a man operating in the dark in every sense, with no good options, no outside authority, no way to ask for help without destroying everything and everyone who depended on it. We don't know what he decided. We can only see the outcome, the sealed well, the altered ground, the missing pages, the paper removed from the tin cup before the fire. What we can say, what the partial and fragmentary evidence allows, is that the room below the vase's well was built in service of a purpose that was, whatever else, an act of sustained and deliberate human care. Someone thought about what a person would need to survive in the dark. Someone counted days, calculated oil, folded blankets, cut the ventilation shaft through limestone to the hillside above. Someone kept a list of names. The names are gone, but the room is still there, below the sealed well, in the hollow between the ridges. The timbers are older now. The plank floor probably collapsed, the limestone working at the mortar for a century and a half. But the natural fisher, the Welsh miner, found when he sounded the ground in 1690 doesn't care about time. It's still there, cool and dark, running north, south beneath the Virginia earth, and on the wall of that room. Louisa's journal mentions this, in what appears to be a transcription of something her father told her, noted in one of the entries not cut out. On the wall, scratched into the limestone by the people who waited there are marks. Not words, as far as Louisa's account suggests. Marks, lines. The kind you make to count days. She doesn't say how many. She doesn't say whether anyone ever finished counting them. That's where the record ends. In a room 30 feet underground, in the dark of the Virginia Hill Country, with a lamp that has oil enough for several more days, blankets folded on a plank floor, and marks on the limestone wall no one has counted in a very long time. This mystery reveals something about the limits of official records, what they can hold, what they choose to discard, about the gap between what happened and what was allowed to be remembered. The vase's story didn't disappear because it was unimportant. It disappeared because it was important in ways that made powerful people very uncomfortable in a period when comfort and power were closely aligned. What do you think happened in that room in the summer of 1858? Do you believe all the names on that list eventually made it north? Or does the thick grass and the silence tell a different story? Leave your comment below. We read every one. And if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those last sections, share it with someone who loves history and doesn't mind losing a little sleep over it. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and join us for the next story. Because there are more rooms below the surface of American history than any official record will ever admit, and we intend to find them.